All right, good day, everybody. We're going to pick up again on some sociology today. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about social interaction in everyday life. And we're going to be building on the material that we covered in the chapter on socialization. You might remember me talking about how chapters 3, 4, and 5 pretty much go together. And in fact, I've said, as you think about sociology early in the semester, think about sociology from how you fit into society at large. Thinking about sociology from your individual standpoint, early on it's easier to think about and understand the field in that manner. Okay? So, as a reminder, in Chapter 3, Socialization, we talked about socialization being the lifelong process by which we develop our human potential and learn culture. Now, learning culture is a critical part of us developing our human potential. And what we mean by that is knowing how to seize opportunities, if you will, or to use the opportunities presented to you in society will help you to develop as a person. So, remember we're talking about rooting the self and the identity of the self in society. So that makeup of society, again, focusing on social experience, that is critical for who we become, the development of the self, right? The I and the me. So without further ado, we are going to jump in and look at some slides that I have prepared here for you. So we're going to start out thinking about individuals, right? Our own values, attitudes, and beliefs. And what we're going to do is we're going to situate that into society at large. So we've talked about how we fit into groups, and our connection with society at large is done through groups, right? So whether it's the family, education, the physical health, mental health as an institution is a little bit more abstract, and we might get to that a little bit later on in the semester. But we connect to society at large, these social institutions in society, through groups. And we've talked about early in the semester in Chapter 1 how social institutions and structure influences the individual, and that's that micro level perspective. And then, again, as I just mentioned at the beginning of this video, thinking about sociology from the individual standpoint, it's a little bit easier to do that early in the study of sociology, because you start situating the individual into society at large, into those groups, into those institutions at large, okay? And so again, we're going to build on that a little bit more today. So back in the chapter on culture, we talked about the framework of culture and thinking about values, attitudes, and beliefs at that micro level, at that individual level. And then we've put a lot of emphasis and focus on norms, guidelines, and expectations for behavior. Now, we take norms for granted in our society. We take for granted what kind of impact they have on us as individuals. And we take for granted the extent that norms help, serve as the glue of society. And how norms are different than formal policy, written law, and regulations is norms are just kind of understood over time through social experience. Formal policy law is written down somewhere. You could go look that up and read that and access that. But sometimes social norms is done just simply through the give and take of interaction with other people. Now, the more experience that individuals have with interactions in society, the better their understanding over time of the norms in given situations. So, norms is a really important term in the field of cultural anthropology, the study of culture, and certainly within the field of sociology. So, but the question becomes, how do we bridge this, that first slide I showed you about social structure, groups, and individuals, and now we're looking at this slide here about culture. How can we integrate those two? And I've created a slide that I think will help do that, right? So we've got individuals, groups, and then all those social institutions that we've mentioned in the first slide. And then we begin to, think about how, again, they're connected through groups, through family, and, different kinds of educational institutions, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But think about that stuff of culture, the formal policy, the norms, the values that we learn within each social institution. Think about that as, pretty much embedded in the interaction of society at large, done so through groups, bridging individuals with one another through groups and connecting to society at large. So when we talk about culture, again, it's not just culture in society, it's culture that we may find in our own families. While we may not have a policy in a family, you may have policies in your family, but oftentimes the rules of families are done through interactions and through what we sometimes call common sense, but it's not common, it's just social experience over time, right? But, as we look at education, I mentioned this just a moment ago, if it depends on which group you're talking about. Are we talking about elementary schools? Are you talking about middle, high school, college, graduate school? There are whole sets of policies, and then you can get down into thinking about individual classes. The culture of one class might be different than the culture of another. So things can get quite complicated, and this is why it's so important for humans to have a breadth of social experience so they can better understand how to adapt in different situations, particularly over the life course. Because things change over time. When you're a very young person, that's quite different than when you become a teenager. And that's certainly quite different than when you become a senior citizen. And of course, there's a time dimension added here that gives us the opportunity to adjust from one stage of life to the next, for example, or to adjust from one type of group setting or organizational setting from one to the next. So this slide, in conclusion with this slide, is an effort of trying to embed culture within society, right, within social institutions, and we can even become a little bit more, focused in as we move forward, and that's what the plan is to do here right now. So I'm going to introduce some new terms, and the first of these terms is called social status. Okay. Oftentimes when we mention social status, people interpret that as what kind of job you have or how much money do you make in society. Notice here in the definition it says the social position that someone occupies. So what determines position, and that could be a whole lot of things, and we're going to look at that here in just a moment. So how do we understand what social status and social position is? Well, that goes back to thinking of the social institutions. And so I'm going to give you an example of one. Oftentimes when we start thinking about position that we occupy in society, the most personal positions that we often cite first are the ones in the family, or the positions that we first cite are those that have an emotional connection to us, okay? So I'm going to use family as an example. Now keep in mind we've got 6, 7 more social institutions that really frame our individual identity. And right here we're just looking at one, right? We're just looking at the family. So let me give you some example of some status positions that I occupy in my family, okay? So I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a son-in-law, I'm a cousin, and this isn't everything. These aren't all the status positions that I occupy in the family. What's really important point to note here, it's a very important point to note, that in order for us to occupy a position in society, we need to have some point of reference. If you look at these status positions, do you notice anything there that might be different than status positions that you might list? And I'll give you one example. For me, grandson is not in this list. Now, I would have written grandson in this list when I was 10 years old, or around that age. But I haven't had grandparents in a long time. I'm an older adult now, not that old, but we're getting there. But my grandparents aren't alive anymore. So as we think about positions that we occupy in society, there has to be a point of reference for us to considering our identity. And so what I mean by the grandson example here, am I still a grandson? If I don't have the grandparents there to interact and sustain that identity, which is what we're talking about here, if I don't have them physically alive, then why would I still consider myself a grandson? What would it be based on? Be based on memory, right? So what is it that forges our identity? If we have a social experience with someone in some context, in some cultural context, that reinforces my identity. Remember in chapter 3, the I and the me? So my identity has got a lot to do with who I interact with. And if there's not somebody there to interact with, it's kind of hard to maintain that identity. You know, I list cousin here as well, way down in the corner. I am a cousin, but I don't interact a lot with my cousins. And so some status positions have more primary importance to us than other status positions. You know, some of the first ones when I was putting this slide together, some of the first ones that I wrote down were father and husband. You know, that's a really big part of my identity at this point in my life, right? Some of you are not going to have father and husband if you're male. You're not going to have those written down because that's an identity that you don't have, especially if you're younger. Now, what that also speaks to is that status positions can change over time. So the next question is, how do I know what I'm supposed to do in these status positions that I occupy? And that's where, well, before we get there, we can also, you know, look at this a little bit more focused. For example, the father and son status positions are part of that group of my nuclear family. Sometimes we refer to also family of origin. So my mother's still alive, my father's not alive anymore, but my mother is, and that's part of my family of origin. I have two brothers, not just one, but that's a separate group. And what I'm getting at here, and we'll also mention extended family here, but what we're getting at is when we start looking at roles here in just a second, sometimes the expectations can overlap, okay? And sometimes there's role conflict between one status position and another status position. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. Now let's look at role. So for every status position listed, right, there are certain expected behaviors of that status position. So expected behaviors of a position that I occupy. Well, how do I know what the expected behaviors are? So if I'm a student in a class, then we talk about the syllabus in class. That's the formal policy. And you learn after the first week or so what the guidelines and expectations, what the norms are. And you've also had, especially in college, you've had a lot of experience of education since you were in elementary school. So you have an idea about how, you know, the relationships between teacher and students work out and how you're supposed to be responsible and accountable and homework. You kind of have an idea what that stuff is, right? Expected behaviors of particular social status. So let me give you an idea about how this can get kind of complicated. So I'm going to go back and again look at the family, and I'm going to pull up just three of the status positions that I had listed a moment ago, okay? Three is some of the most important status positions that I occupy. So as we think about expected behaviors, what are some expected behaviors of each status, okay? So what roles do I have in the position of being a father? So as I'm sitting here thinking about what does it mean to be a father? Well, I'm supposed to raise my children. Now, not everybody does that. So expected behaviors and norms, you know, there's a relationship there, right? So I'm supposed to love everybody in my family. I'm supposed to respect and treat everyone fairly. And that's just some of the expected behaviors, right? As a father. So yeah, those roles, and then I add in the roles of my husband, of being not my husband, me as a husband to my wife. And so I'm supposed to attend to the needs of my spouse. I'm supposed to support my spouse. You know, sometimes, and again, I mentioned this just a moment ago, sometimes the roles of different status positions can overlap. Sometimes they can be in conflict, right? So one thing about being a father is whether or not I should be a father and also a friend to my child. And you can think about that. I mean, do you have a friendly relationship with your parents, or are your parents your parents? And I can tell you that parents sometimes, you know, struggle with that a little bit. Whether or not we should do what's right as a parent to raise our child, or do some parents do what they want do some parents do what their kids want, even though it might not be in the best interest of their children? Sometimes you see this happening with blended families. So let's say you've got a stepmom or stepdad and you've got two different families, especially if your biological mother and father, if they're in two different families now, if they aren't communicating very well, sometimes one parent might buy you more than the other parent buys you, or one parent tries to treat you better than the other, and can be some role conflict and role strain. You'll see that in this chapter as well. So depending on the makeup of your family, roles can vary, and even the definition of roles can be a little bit different from status position to status position. I mentioned son because I've been married for over 20 years now, and in the first couple of years of marriage, my wife experienced the same thing with her family. Are we still beholden to our family of origin? And one of the things that we struggled with in the first few holidays, first couple of years of holidays, is do we spend more time with my parents or more time with her parents? And there's some role conflict there, and sometimes some of you know that I'm a DJ and I DJ weddings, and I see this playing out sometimes in a wedding reception right after they get married. Do you give more attention to the bride's parents or the groom's parents, and how do you navigate that? Sometimes I see this playing out in real time when I'm DJing events, right? So again, there could be crossover here with family statuses and that sort of thing. So 3 other terms here that I want to mention: a scribe status and achieve status. An achieve status is something that you earn. So for example, I'm a teacher. That's something that I've earned. So not just anybody can teach. You have to have certain credentials and qualifications. Well, that's an achieve status. Now, achievement doesn't always mean good. So if if I'm a gambler and I spend all my money and I go homeless, I've achieved the status of being homeless. Now, we have a tendency to look at homelessness not as a good thing, but in this case, again, it's something that I've earned, as opposed to an ascribed status. An ascribed status is something that you're born with or that you involuntarily assume. Okay, so we're going to be talking after break about social class. And there's a question that will come up during that chapter: is social class an ascribed status, something you're born with, or a social class an achieved status? And there's a lot to be said about your family of origin, the family that you were socialized in. Social class is very much passed on from generation to generation. So a young child doesn't have any control over their social class, right? And you got to think, do poor people, middle class people, and rich people, do they raise children differently? Well, of course they do. They have different sets of resources. So to what extent is social class learned? To what extent is social class earned? Okay? You might be surprised about that when we get to the chapter on social class. And the last term here that I want to illustrate is master status. So master status is a single status that dominates every status. Now, these are very significant status positions. So for example, President of the United States, once you've been president, you'll be president for the rest of your life. People will identify you that way first and foremost. It's a very powerful status. Now think about that. Some social positions have a lot of power in society. In our personal lives, some social status positions have tremendous power over everything else as to who we are. Okay. Your book illustrates people that are physically disabled. So if you're relegated to a wheelchair, and people that are in wheelchairs will sometimes share this, that they would rather be treated as a person than as someone confined to a wheelchair. If you think about people that have visible recognition of status position, we have a tendency to treat people in terms of how we see them rather than how they are, if you will. So we have a tendency to treat people based on gender or perceived gender. We have a tendency to treat people according to race. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Is race a social position? Absolutely it is. And it could vary from place to place, culture to culture. Is whether or not you're male or female, is that a social position? Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you're born male into a society, do you infer privileges simply because you're male? If you're born female into society, do you infer privileges, or are you, a different class of citizen, if you will? And you look at the course of history, there's absolutely something to be said about the consideration of those dimensions of gender and race and even social class that I mentioned just a moment ago. Okay, so to sum it up again, we've got social structure, right, and social institutions. We've got culture that's embedded within those institutions and groups. And within those institutions and groups, we also have an understanding about positions that we're supposed to occupy within those groups. That's social status. And then the expected behaviors, and that gets more down close to the individual. You can see behaviors listed there under groups, between groups and the individual. We know the expected behaviors of us in certain social status positions that we occupy. Right? Okay, so that's going to end for this section on social status and role in similar terms, and I'll be back with you again with another lecture sometime soon.